Since 2018, when we had the first Martin Roth Symposium and asked questions about what culture is and who it's for and why it matters, of course, a lot has changed. COVID-19 has really changed the way, particularly how museums need to be thinking about how they engage with the world. There isn't, it's an obvious thing to say, there isn't a social society, a civil society organization that hasn't been affected by this dramatic change. The need for social distancing, the need for masks, the fact that we can't be together in the way that people want to be together. And one of the most fundamental things about culture is that it is made by and for and with other human beings. And then more recently, of course, the dramatic visibility of an old problem of state-sanctioned violence against people of color, and the racism, the color-based racism in which that kind of phenomenon is grounded. Now that that has become such a prominent global conversation, I also think that the whole conversation about inequality, which was already, of course, on the horizon in 2018, that whole conversation has become much more pressing and more directly focused on inequities grounded in race and ethnicity. I think we've seen a recognition in the last half year or so that the Me Too movement that was very present in the summer of 2018, that although we've seen some change, we haven't seen a kind of full scale redress in the way that cultural organizations can help make change. So I think that's perhaps where there hasn't been quite enough change, I would say. Museums have a major role to play in addressing the crises of our moment and continuing the work that they had begun at the time of the first Martin Roth Symposium of really addressing their relevance, how they are meaningful for all people and not just for the historically sort of privileged communities that built museums and were part of them. Museums, in the end, with their big buildings and places that they are made to gather people. And in fact, gathering people and being with community had become their focus more than ever in this century. And in fact, Martin Roth was a huge proponent of the museum as a gathering space that truly serves different communities, nationally, locally, and internationally. In the olden days, in much of the 20th century, museums were just as much about building collections, about preserving those collections, and sort of about internal scholarship, curatorial scholarship. They were just as much about that, and even more sometimes, than about the visitor experience. Now, museums are all supposed to be about the community of which the museum itself forms a part. You can engage people around the art that they know, the cultures they come from, but also let them see the humanity of other cultures by working with these objects. I think contemporary art is a real opportunity there because contemporary art has really moved for decades now. Contemporary art has moved out of the white cube gallery into the street, into schools, into public spaces of all sorts, into the park and the street and the public plaza. And since the museum has also been doing a pretty good job recently of trying to bring that kind of energy back into the museum, around contemporary art installations, whether they engage with what's in the museum or not, a lot can be done. Sometimes in new countries, so to speak, or young countries like Abu Dhabi and the UAE, of which it forms a part, a new conversation is possible that's harder to have when you have really long traditions of museums or ways of being in a society. More directly in culture, the Louvre Abu Dhabi and a much older cultural foundation that was created in 1980 are two institutions that pay lots of attention to access, outreach, broad education around making the full experience of culture available to people and creating programs for all to attend. when museums think about what they should be doing now, they should allow themselves to entertain a little bit more. They should be resolute about saying museums are also about pleasure. Culture involves lots of serious things, knowledge, science, questions, rituals, and so forth. And it also, culture involves festivity, amusement, humor, comedy, wit, a critique that's kind of effective by mobilizing kind of enjoyable resources. And I think it's really important for museums to embrace that possibility if they're going to compete with digital culture today and social media culture, which is full of serious stuff, but also full of wit, as we know. Martin Roth was one of the great entrepreneurial museum directors. And so when we've been thinking about the Martin Roth Symposium, both the first and the second, we've often asked this question: do museums today need a more enterprising entrepreneurial culture, and particularly one that embraces failures, that allows us to fail forward? He would say, this is not a time to put our lives on hold. This is a time to innovate. This is a time to see how we can work together to make a better future today. And I think he'd be focused on that and calling on us to be with him to do that.